Bonjour à tous. Donc aujourd'hui, on fait une émission spéciale d'une certaine façon. Je suis avec Preston Manning qui a fondé ici, dans l'Ouest canadien, le Reform Party à une certaine époque. Il a été aussi, à compter de 97, le chef de l'opposition officielle à la Chambre des communes à Ottawa. Mr. Manning, welcome and thank you very much for having us today and to have such a discussion. I wanted to talk to you because for many conservatives, even like myself in Quebec, you're kind of a mentor because you did start a movement out of almost nothing here in Alberta.
Yeah, that's true.
And you brought it on the national stage. You became the leader of the official opposition in Ottawa. And you were in politics for principles. You've been a principled guy your whole life. And I think it's important that a guy from Alberta like you tells us a little bit more about what you see that Quebec and the West have in common. And that's why I'm here during this, this tour, because I want to see the similarities, because I think we have much more in common than what we read in the mainstream media.
Well, no, and thanks for getting in touch with me and giving me this chance to talk to you. Because we met a long time ago.
A very long time ago.
In Ottawa. And a lot of water's gone under the bridge since then. Well, just to start with, Quebec and the West have this third-party tradition, which makes us fundamentally different than Atlantic Canada or Ontario. You know, Quebec going way back, the Bloc Populaire, the Union Nationale, the PQ, the BQ.
The Socreds. We had the Socreds in Quebec as well.
And the West has had the same. He's had these the old Progressive Party, which was a farmers' party, the Farmers' Party, the United Farmers of Alberta, the Depression parties of the CCF, which became the NDP, Social Credit. So one thing we have in common is a willingness to support third-party movements. And, you know, in Quebec it's been different than in the West, but that's some common ground, which means what you're trying to do in Quebec is not some oddball, eccentric thing, any more than starting a new party in Western Canada is not considered an oddball thing. It's that's been part of our political tradition.
Even your government currently, it's a party that a merger of two parties a few years ago, and it keeps going. It's organic, kind of.
And so, you know, Quebecers want to honor their third-party tradition. They ought to recognize you as a legitimate expression of what's happened in Quebec for 100 years. So that's one of the major things. And then on the more public policy constitutional basis, Quebec and the West both want a more decentralized federation. They want the federal government to stay out of these areas of provincial jurisdiction. It's not necessarily a hostility to the federal government, but the Canadian Constitution says here's the areas that are federal responsibilities, here's the areas that are provincial responsibilities. The country wouldn't have come together in the first place if there hadn't been that division. And I think that's one of the basic common elements. It's not well recognized between Quebec and the West. We both want a more decentralized federation. Maybe sometimes for different reasons. Quebec, greater emphasis on wanting more decentralization for social and linguistic and cultural reasons. The West, it's almost entirely for economic reasons. But that's one of the big things that we have in common. And I think the West and Quebec ought to work together to get that more decentralized constitution.
But I want to challenge you a little bit when you say that here it's for more for economic reasons than natural resources. I think it would be the same in Quebec if they did behave the same way they do with your oil and gas. With our hydroelectricity, because we have to explain to people that you know, for us, the federal government doesn't interfere in the development of our hydroelectricity plans, but they do for your oil and gas plants. And if they were doing the same, I'm quite sure in Quebec we would have screamed a little bit louder.
Uprising, So there's even more commonality there. I think one of the whole areas that needs a change of attitude in Ottawa is the recognition of the natural resource sectors, agriculture, energy, forestry, mining, and fisheries are fundamental building blocks of the Canadian economy. They're not relics from the past, and they're not environmental liabilities, which is what Ottawa tends to look at them for. And that might be another area where, I mean, absolute importance of natural resource sectors to the Quebec economy. That's the same out here. And you know, when you think of it internationally, like on what international front is Canada a player? Like, we don't have the biggest population, we don't have the biggest financial resources, we don't have the most brilliant federal government.
Yeah. No, for sure.
but what we do have, we have the second largest land mass of any country in the world, which means you have either the first or the second largest stock of natural resources. That's where Canada is an economic player. And for us to denigrate or ignore the natural resource sectors of either Quebec or the West or any part of the country is just a fundamental mistake.
Yeah, because if we were applying today the same standards that we want to push in terms of environment, there would be no regions left in Canada. I travel across all the regions of Quebec, and it's always the first thing that, you know, the local mayors or entrepreneurs tell me is, you know, we can't develop anymore. Like, they're stuck, they're handcuffed. But historically, it was our growth potential because we were open to development. Nowadays, you saw even the federal minister yesterday said, no roads anymore in Canada. We're not going to build roads anymore for cars.
Well, he didn't mention trucks. Like, I mean, in this country, you know, the transportation industry is absolutely fundamental to holding it together, the capacity to move resources and goods and services across the country, and yet to make a statement like that,
it's kind of weird.
I think that should drive the truckers out of their support camp.
And it's not going to be for the vaccine this time around. Mr. Manning, I'm going to be... maybe I don't want to hurt your feelings, but I want to tell you just the perception that in Quebec there was historically vis-a-vis the Reform Party. Many Quebecers at the time, and we're talking about the 90s, saw it as a movement, an anti-Quebec movement. That's how the mainstream media presented your party at the time. They tried to demonize you. How is it possible? Because they're doing the same thing with us. It's not on the same issues, but it's like we're radical left, we're Donald Trump. It's the same kind of campaign that they've done against you. What are the tools that we could use as Quebec conservatives? What are the lessons that you've learned vis-a-vis those campaigns to try to discredit you politically that could be successful today?
Well, one of the things, and I think you're doing this by coming out west, is to find allies and people that are willing to endorse you, or at least to say, look, no, this is not what he's doing. is not some wild thing. This is part of the Quebec tradition, the creation of third parties because they get dissatisfied with the status quo. That is a fundamental part of the political culture of Quebec, just as it is in the West. And to sort of get other people, you know, in communications, one of the things your communications guys say to you when you've got a message to get across is, out of whose mouth would this message be most credible? So when you say, look, I'm not a wild guy, because he said, well, of course he doesn't think he's a wild guy. But if somebody else says, no, you may disagree with him, but he's not some fringe phenomena. Other people saying that, I think, can be helpful. One of the difficulties we had in making any grounds in Quebec, well, the main one was I wasn't bilingual. I took language lessons, but these instructors said, you're the worst kind of student because you're a perfectionist. You won't try unless you can do it well, and you can't do it well, so you won't try. Whereas my wife, you've met my wife, Sandra's a people person. She'll try anything. The first class we went to, they separated us. They said, she's going to make progress. You're a problem. But that was, I wasn't, and I used to have, I had one speech in Quebec that never got anywhere, but it was Où est La Fontaine? I went way back to in the old days when they were trying to create responsible government in Canada. This is before Confederation. There was Baldwin, represented the Reform Party of Upper Canada, and La Fontaine represented the Lower Canada Reform movement. And I kept saying, where's La Fontaine? Where's your La Fontaine?
So you didn't fight your lieutenant?
I never could. So I think that's, so I guess coming back to your original question, I think other people, you know, just making statements that legitimates what you're trying to do could be could be helpful. You know, that's one thing that occurs to me.
Mr. Manning, you choose to do federal politics instead of provincial politics. You could have done provincial politics. Your father was premier here in Alberta. You were well known locally. You won Alberta like no one before you. Why did you choose federal politics instead of provincial politics?
Well, like my father's, he was premier he became premier when I was 1 year old, and he retired. He was never defeated. He retired when I was 26.
So he managed the province for 25 years?
As premier, and he was actually 36 years in the legislature, the entire life. But these populist bottom-up parties, they're like a person. They are born, they mature, and they die. You know,
it's a normal cycle of life.
Yeah, that's a cycle of life, and I could tell, and he could tell. That was partly why he retired in 1968. That they'd had a long run of running Alberta, but it was going to be replaced by something.
And their time was done.
Yeah, and so and then I always had an interest in the federal arena. When I went to the University of Alberta, interesting, the young guys that get involved. Joe Clark was the leader of the campus progressive conservatives. Jim Coots, who became Pierre Trudeau's principal secretary, was the leader of the Liberals. Grant Notley, who became the NDP leader and the father of Rachel Notley here in Alberta. He was the head of the NDP. Ray Speaker, who became a cabinet minister both in Alberta and a member of parliament. These were all guys in the university politics. And I knew Joe, and Joe tried to suggest to me, well, why don't you come along? Joe didn't argue that.
Wanted to bring you with the Conservative Party.
And Joe didn't argue that everything was perfect with the Progressive Conservative Party, but he wanted to change it and work from within and so forth. But I remember saying, or at least thinking, I think he even said it to Joe, no, I think I'll wait. The West is going to produce a new thing, maybe 20 years from now.
So you felt it coming.
I think I'll wait around.
You were ready to wait.
Yeah. So that was.
But you did, even if you didn't become prime minister, you did change the course of Canadian politics, because in Quebec we know that it was the same election, the race of the Bloc Québécois and the Reform Party in the 1993 election, which is a historic moment in Canada's history, because it's an election that we went from a conservative government to almost the progressive conservatives disappearing. I mean, they ended up with 2 seats. You ended up with 52 seats. The Bloc Québécois ended up with 54 seats, if I recall properly. And it was the split of the small C conservative movement and the Conservative Party of today, and of Stephen Harper and Pierre Poilievre now, is much closer to your Reform Party than the Progressive Conservatives of Joe Clark.
And one encouraging thing, like I've been critical of Western world democracy, has got a lot of things wrong with it, but whatever, the tools that the free democratic system gives, we started with 5 people, and that morphed into an opposition party, and then we morphed it into the Canadian Alliance, and then Stephen and Peter MacKay morphed it one more time into the Conservative Party. Something that started with 5 people meeting in an office room here, it ended up creating a national government for 9 years. You could not do that in the United States.
No.
You could not do that in France or England. The fact that the freedom to do that here means that you can start very small, and who knows how far it'll go. Coming back to your original question, though, I didn't answer that properly on how do we handle this antagonism to a new party, and always positioning it as it's on the far right or the far left or the far whatever. And you and I have talked about this. I think this dividing the political world into left, right, center, which comes from the days of the French Revolution, when the conservative types sat on the right and the other guys sat on the left. Like, why are we using that terminology 200 years later? And I've written a bit on this. I think and in that framework, conservatives always get shoved to 1/3 of the political space. There's left, there's center, and then there's this bunch on the right. You automatically are confined to
a fringe
a third of the, and then of course they say, and you're on the fringe of that, so you're right wing extremists. I think a more accurate framework that describes what's occurring in a number of countries, including the United States and including the Trump phenomena, is another division is between the aristocratic faction, the elites, who would like to restrict the role of the ordinary people in the governance of their affairs, versus the small p populists who want to expand the role of the ordinary people in
so the elite against the people. So you're more populist than the right
wing. I think that's the great division now. And populism, you have to acknowledge, it can have a wild and woolly side.
It's pejorative.
But on the other side,
that word in Quebec, when they say it in French, populiste, they tend to say like it's not good. It's
and this
pejorative.
is the academics and elites always use that, but there is a positive populism, and in North America there's no better example of positive populism than Western Canada. Western Canada's had more experience with populism than any other region of North America, not just Canada. And I get into discussions on this. I say, who was the first woman elected to an elected assembly in the British Empire? Her name was Irene Parlby, and she was elected in 1918 to the Alberta legislature, and she ran through the non-partisan league, which was a populist bottom-up thing. In Ottawa, I used to ask, who was the first woman that got elected to the Canadian Parliament? Agnes Campbell MacPhail. She did not come through the Liberals or Conservatives. In fact, they fought her. Eventually, the Liberals defeated her. She came up through the populist, progressive farmers movement.
And I don't want to rebound on what you're saying, but in Quebec, we've elected the first Jewish guy in the British Empire in Trois with Francophones who elected him. And the British Crown didn't allow him to become a member, so they called a by-election, and the population in Trois-Rivières re-elected him.
Well, and in other words, populism is able to accomplish some positive things.
Very positive things.
And then, and again, where this left-right center thing doesn't fit. Who originated Canadian Medicare? You know, the CCF, the Canadian Commonwealth Federation in Saskatchewan, which was a bottom-up. Now, it would have been called left to center, but it was another one of these bottom-up parts. So when people say
populism is not right-wing or left-wing,
and it's not. It can be wild and woolly, but it can accomplish some very positive things. So I think the 21st century division of the political landscape that's more relevant today is the aristocratic elitist factions who disregard ordinary people. They think they're too ignorant. They think they're not educated. They think they'll chase after unprincipled leaders who want to reduce their role in governance, versus people who believe in ordinary people, that if they're given the right information, given the right kind of leadership, they can play a positive role in the governance of our affairs.
Isn't it the same thing that we're facing now with the modern, all the environmentalists' approach? You know, like, I'm superior to the others because I have my Tesla at $100,000, and you're with your oil or your gas car with at $2,000-3,000. It's kind of an elitist thing. To the environmental debate is between the people and the elite on many fronts.
And I think that's the division, and I think you represent that positive populist position and element in Quebec, just as we did in the federal arena, and when you start counting the numbers, there's an awful lot more ordinary people than there are aristocrats when they get to the polls. You know,
in Quebec we don't split between left and right. We don't split between elitists and populists. For the last half century, we did split between the separatists and the federalists, unfortunately. And it's an old debate. We're turning around. It's leading nowhere. Quebec, I'm not saying the no or the yes camp that lost. It's all Quebecers lost. You know, we lost after the first referendum when we got the repatriation of the Constitution without our will. We lost after the second referendum with the Clarity Act that wanted to dictate to us the rules for the future. And now there's a third referendum coming up if the PQ stays popular. That's my whole life. We've been trying to get out of that debate and polarize like all the normal societies between less or more government or more populist, more elitist. But it's very, very tough because we're kind of stuck in that mud. And it's how could we get out of there?
Well, I don't. It seems to me that it requires some changes at the federal level to make Quebec feel more at home in Canada, and the West. Those same changes are necessary to make the West more feel at home.
Your slogan in the days was "The West wants in."
Oh, yeah,
because
yeah.
you felt you were kicked, you were put aside from the Confederation.
And back in those days, there was a separatist movement in Alberta. There was a separatist candidate elected to the Alberta legislature. There was this anger at how the
if you hadn't been there, the separatist movement would have probably been much stronger.
Well, and we use this analogy that, like in the oil patch, there's a thing called the wildcat well, where you drill a well into a formation, you don't know what's down below there, and so you can hit a pocket of gas and oil. And then there's a rogue well where you hit gas and it blows the drilling platform, drilling rig off the platform. It can catch fire. It can be a very dangerous type of thing. But the way you deal with a wildcat or with a rogue well, one way of dealing positively is you drill in a relief well from the side to take off the pressure. And then you can install valves and bring this very valuable resource, because there's a lot of energy down there, into production. And in a way, that's what reform was. There was all this anger, and it was like going to be a rogue well, and it could be very dangerous. And we drilled it. Now, if you drill in from the side, you've got to connect with that energy and what's wrong. So you got to connect to it, but you then try to say, look, we can harness this energy in a different way. Why don't we reform the way the Federation works so that we feel at home? And I think that's part of the challenge for what changes at the federal level have to be made to make Quebec feel more at home in the Federation and the West feel more at home. And it comes back to what we talked about originally. One of the things is for the federal government to respect provincial jurisdiction in the area of natural resources, in the area of health care, in the area of the environment. And that would be one step in the right direction, maybe not the whole answer. I used to have this argument with Jean Chrétien before the second referendum. We'll go to see him. I was worried about the country cracking apart. And Chrétien's position on a lot of things was that status quo is good enough. It's okay, and his message to Quebec is, look, you're better off now than you ever would be.
It's the best country in the world.
Yeah. It's just, and the status quo is good. And I used to argue with him, when you're competing with a dream, because Bouchard had a dream, and I heard him express his dream. You got to compete with a better dream. You can't compete by just saying, no, it's okay the way it is. Okay, and Chrétien rejected that. No, we don't have to do that. We don't have to have a dream of some better federalism. We just got to convince people that what we got is good enough. And they came within a hair of losing that. If 36,000 people
could have gone one way or the other.
Yeah. So I think that's not a whole answer, but a restructured federation that makes the provinces, and it's not just Quebec, more at home in the federation and more prepared to cope with the 21st century. That'd be a step in the right direction.
But you know,
well, what that means is you need allies in Ottawa, and your ally is Pierre Poilievre and the Conservative Party of Canada. They have this commitment to respect the provincial jurisdiction more so than the Liberals of the NDP.
Of course, obviously, philosophically conservatives are by nature more decentralist, but there also needs to be an interprovincial link between the conservative leaders as well, because I feel that they are even more decentralist than Pierre Poilievre, because they are at the provincial level and they see the problems with the Federation much more than in Ottawa. And I think that there's kind of a rebirth provincially. Like I've met yesterday the BC leader of the Conservative Party that is going up right now, and we're an example in Quebec as well.
And what Danielle Smith has done here,
Danielle Smith, it's something else. The Saskatchewan Party next door as well,
Scott,
and the Conservatives elsewhere in the country. Now the Conservatives are controlling the provinces. Like it's not like it used to be. But those people are much more decentralist when they're provincial politicians than when they are in Ottawa, for all sorts of reasons, but and we've never had a real conservative. And you founded a movement. I want to go with the Manning Foundation and the Canada Strong and Free, because that's one of the ways that conservative leaders and at the provincial level meet. Also, that's once a year we kind of get together, and that's also in the same spirit of decentralization and autonomy of provinces.
Yeah, there is a need for conservatives across the country to cooperate more. Like a lot of these even provincial Conservative parties operate in silos. They don't do much with even the other provincial Conservative parties, and we just can't afford to be that divided up. You know, if we are united on principles like decentralization, why not get together and figure out how to express that better and more? You know, that would be, and then the fact that you're doing that, that you've met with the BC Conservative leader, you've met with Danielle here. That's good. Other provincial Conservative leaders should go once a year on a cross-country tour, and it doesn't. You don't have to have big public meetings either.
No.
These can be just private meetings. Just get to know each other.
Just hang out together.
And
because you know, I'm concerned personally of. I see the polls. I see the Parti québécois ahead. I see that they're more radical than ever. That's something that in English Canada they don't really know. But the Parti québécois now is more radical in its policies, in its program, than the Jacques Parizeau Parti québécois. They're promising a referendum for sure if elected at the beginning of their mandate. But the figures are, if there were a referendum today in Quebec, it would be the same results as in 1980. So Quebec would lose again. We would come out of that split. It's not good even for the decentralists from outside of Canada, because it reassures the Jean Chrétien of this world, of the Justin Trudeau, that everything is perfect in Canada as is. And it kills any kind of reform of the federation.
No, well, I think it's imperative that you do well in Quebec, and that there be a greater cooperation between Conservatives across the country. And if Pierre Poilievre is successful, and the polls would indicate that he has a good chance of forming the next government, this thinking through what does respecting provincial jurisdiction mean. It's one thing to have speeches on it. It's another thing to be running the federal government. Okay, what does this actually mean? What does this mean with respect to health care? What amendments have to be made to the Canada Health Act to give the provinces more room to do what they want to do, as long as they respect universal access to health care? Why not let the provinces have more liberty to do something different and see what works better? I mean, but that requires a decision by that federal government to permit more decentralization of health care.
You know, like us, I think we're the party probably in Canada that goes the furthest in terms of private healthcare, because in Quebec, as you know, we already have a private healthcare system that is in place, that is quite extensive, and the Conservative Party wants to go even further. We really want to have a parallel system.
And it's not like I even stayed away a little bit from the use of private health. What we want is nobody's talking about going from a publicly dominated system to a private dominated. We're talking about a mixed system.
Exactly.
Like the Scandinavians,
like
there's
France.
40 countries in the world that outperform us on virtually every indicator except cost per patient. We're at the top there. But nobody's talking about destroying the current. I mean, in our legislature here in Alberta, there are actually NDP members who think, they believe in a conspiracy theory that in some dark corner of the universe, there's some people trying to figure out how to sell the public health, the public hospitals to some evil entrepreneurs who will then charge you for health care. There's actually people in the legislature that believe in that conspiracy theory, and it's complete nonsense.
I know.
Nobody's talking about
that. And it's even worse than that. They often have their ideal, the Scandinavian countries, especially Sweden. But if you go in Stockholm today, there's private healthcare, there's public transit. There's part of your pension plan that is private. There's voucher schools.
And they used to have a system. 30 years ago, they had a system like ours.
But they did fix it.
And they moved beyond it. And
we're stuck with the old model.
Well, one of the things we've been proposing is just a colloquium sometime in 2024 where you bring in representatives from, say, the two of the systems in Europe that outperform us on virtually every category, you know, beds per thousand, ICUs per thousand, nurses per thousand, shortness of waiting times for emergency physicians, for general physicians, practitioners. There's countries that outperform us on all. Bring in two of the best and just ask them two questions. One is, what are the distinctive characteristics of your system that enable you to outperform ours? What is it? They're going to come up with, we got a mixed system. And then the second question is, how did you get, what changes in your laws or your policies did you have to make to get from where you used to be to where you are there? And just invite health ministers and the premiers and the media and whoever. You don't have to even make a commitment. Just come and listen to these people. And is there something we can learn from what they're doing to change our system? But it would require a federal government that allows the provinces, which the delivery of health care is in the provincial purview, the federal government that would allow the provinces to experiment and they could set criteria. They could say, whatever you do, you can't reduce the universal character. Nobody's talking about eliminating the universal character.
We don't need the federal government as a nanny state to tell the provinces what to do.
And that's just one area.
They're accountable to the people who elected them anyway, much more than the federal government. It's always this perception that if the federal government is not there, the provinces are going to go wild. Like they can't go wild. They're accountable to their voters.
Yeah, and so there's these different areas. Healthcare is one where this greater recognition of provincial jurisdiction would be helpful for everybody. The natural resource sectors and the balanced approach on the environment. Those would be three areas where an election of a more sympathetic federal government could reduce a lot of these federal-provincial tensions and actually benefit the country on three.
But the Liberals are good at one thing. We have to give it to them. They're able to, it seems that they coordinate and they're able to work together. And for us, it's always we're each other in our provinces and we're working, separately from each other. And we don't have the strength of being all together to fight, counterattack. I guess it's because we do believe more in the individuals, so we work a little bit more by ourselves. But and they have also the mainstream media often that is an asset for them. But that dynamic needs to change. And we also have the language barrier because historically, the conservative movement has been associated to English Canada for all sorts of reasons, religious reasons even. It has nothing to do with political ideology, and it is a barrier. You felt it when you were a reform leader, and I feel it today. Even it's going to take a generation or so to get rid of that label.
Yeah, and one thing that would help the federal people, like the most successful prime ministers had these regional lieutenants. Like John A. Macdonald had Cartier in Quebec and Tupper in Atlantic Canada. And these were guys that could not just win their own seat. These were people that were respected by the electorate of Lower Canada, and he could explain what they were trying to do in a way that Macdonald never could directly to Quebecers, and that's a missing element today. You look at the current leaders, and it was the same with Laurier. He had Sifton in the West, and Oliver these were lieutenants in Western Canada that were respected in their own right, and they brought in support for the party. Mackenzie King had Saint Laurent during the war in Quebec, and C.D. Howe in Ontario. These were strong regional representatives who could communicate. Today, these who's Justin Trudeau's Western lieutenant? Like, it's almost a joke to raise it. There's nobody.
There's nobody.
And this is a thing that I think Pierre Poilievre could work on. Who's can he get a Quebec lieutenant? Can he get an Atlantic lieutenant? Can he get a Western lieutenant? That would help. I think that would help, particularly make
Who is
the
it
case.
right now? Maybe in the West he has, like, maybe Andrew Scheer because it's a former leader.
Well, he's pretty strong himself in the West because his origins. Pierre was on my constituency association board when he was a teenager. Like, he was in Calgary here. He's been involved. And one of the things I admire about him is one of the things you watch with younger people is their capacity for growth. Does it stall at a certain point, or can they get more responsibility and bigger horizons? Can they grow? And I've been very impressed with his capacity to grow into virtually a potential prime minister from a teenager that was coming to reform.
And Pierre has a strength that, he's from out west originally. As you said, he was on your board association. Then he moved to Ottawa, got elected in Ottawa. He met a girl from Montreal who's from Latin America, but whose main language is French.
Impressive too.
Yes, and Pierre is the first leader since Brian Mulroney that is perfectly bilingual.
That
we have.
That.
So he has roots he has a little bit of roots in every single region of the country. So that's probably a strength for him as well. And plus, he has a French name. Like for us, Poliev, it's much easier to pronounce than for you.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. No, there's a lot of positive things, and what you're the support that you're getting in Quebec. And if I had anything to say to Quebecers, it would be that you are in the third-party tradition of Quebec, which has produced governments. These bottom-up movements are not irresponsible fringe elements. They eventually mature into governments, that you're part of that tradition, and that you have potential allies in other parts of the country, particularly on this issue of a more decentralized federation. These are some big positives.
Mr. Manning, I want also to talk, and this was the main reason why I wanted to talk to you today. Finally, my introduction is over. I'm kidding. But I wanted to talk to you about something because Premier Smith here in Alberta named you president of a committee to study what happened during the COVID crisis and the lessons that need to be learned out of it. And you were surrounded by experts and citizens to make an effort of understanding. It's kind of an inquiry of what happened and what can we do better if ever another crisis hits us. And I just want us to explain, because in Quebec, our government initially opened the door to a public inquiry, then shut it down, and we didn't have any lessons. We spent $17 billion of contract without any submissions. We wasted 3 years for many people. It had huge impacts, and there's never ever going to be an evaluation. So I just want to understand, how come here it worked, how did it work, and what were your conclusions? It's a huge question, but we can exchange on it.
The focus, and to her credit, the Alberta government under Premier Smith is the only one that authorized any kind of investigation. Now, it had fairly narrow terms of reference. We were to look at the legislation. It was basically a legislative panel to look at the legislation that authorized the orders and regulations whereby the Alberta government responded to the COVID crisis, and to suggest amendments to that legislation to better equip the province to handle future public emergencies. That's a long one-sentence definition of our terms of reference. So, and the three basic lessons that came out of it, there's a report, it's on the Alberta government's website, and people can look at it. The three basic lessons that are relevant at the federal sphere, relevant to other provinces, are these. The first one was that the management of these public emergencies, in our view, should be assigned to an agency that is specifically designed to handle public emergencies. In Alberta, there's the Alberta Emergency Management Agency. What happened, because it was a health emergency, and this is what happened in Ottawa, it was automatically assigned to the health department, which is certainly has to be consulted on the health aspect. But when the response measures had social implications, legal implications, economic implications, that the chief medical officer of health here can't be expected to know that. And so one of our recommendations is that we do have this emergency management agency. It was not beefed up to be able to handle this, but it should be. And so we made a bunch of...
I just want to make sure I understand properly. Before you declare the state of emergency, like we did in Quebec and everywhere else, there needs to be some experts that are specialized, not in health, not in environment,
just handle
emergency period, because you're depriving citizens from their civic rights, their individual freedom, their democracy. So it's very important to have people who are specialized on emergencies per se.
Because if you don't, like if you ask the chief medical officer of health in say in Alberta, how big is the Alberta economy? She might say, well, why are you asking me? I'm a doctor. Well, it happens to be a $300 billion economy. If you impose a measure that causes an 8% contraction of that economy, which was happened here, you have done $24 billion worth of damage by that one
one decision.
And you can't expect a doctor to know, or the employment implications. Alberta has 2 million full-time jobs. We had a 7% spike in unemployment, almost all in the private sector, not in the public sector. That's 140,000 jobs that were jeopardized by the shutdown. orders. And the doctors in charge of that can't be expected to know that's one of the consequences of doing that. That's why you need this agency that has the broader perspective. And most provinces have these agencies. Now, Alberta, it's called the Emergency Management Agency, but they were not beefed up to handle this kind of thing. So our recommendations are, we have about 8 recommendations to that statute to beef it up. And in the future, if there's an emergency, they're the bunch that are assigned coordinating responsibilities. So that's one thing.
That's the first
one. The second thing is that, you know, under the Canadian Constitution, the state can limit the rights and freedoms that are guaranteed there if it can prove that they are justifiable and reasonable under the circumstances in a free and democratic society. But what we pointed out is that these response measures to COVID very much restricted rights and freedoms, all kinds, freedom of assembly, freedom of mobility.
You didn't have a curfew here, though, eh? Like we had in Quebec. You were
but,
fortunate
but
enough.
That's another, a lot of these measures just restrict these rights. So we say if these response measures actually these response measures, you need to protect rights, and you want to protect the public from 2 things. You want to protect them from the harms of the emergency, but you want to increase the protection of their rights and freedoms during an emergency because those will be threatened by these limitations. So we propose, we can't propose, there's no point proposing amendments to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but Alberta has an Alberta Bill of Rights. And we
just like Quebec, we
recommend about 20 amendments to that bill to strengthen the protection of rights and freedoms, particularly during a public emergency. So
I have a question with that, because we felt that the Constitution and the Quebec Bill of Rights was protecting us for that, and they said, okay, that we're not. But for everyone, they violated our freedoms, even those are guaranteed by our charters. But so even if we amend the charter, it's not going to change anything because they suspended the charter anyway. They didn't care about the charter at one point during the crisis. So wasn't it a political decision more than a legal?
Well, it is. And what was compounded it was when people went to the courts, the lower court, and they only went to the lower courts. It never got to the Supreme Court.
Not yet.
But it went to the lower courts. The lower courts just went along with, whatever the government's doing is justifiable and reasonable in a democratic society. But the way you deal with the court, this is where my background is, I'm a legislator. I'm not a lawyer. The lawyer who launches one of those suits, he got to go to the court and he has to argue and persuade the court within the way the law is. A legislator said, if you don't like what the courts are doing or you think they're misinterpreting, you direct the courts to do something different, and you direct the courts through amending the statute. The courts can't quarrel with the Alberta Bill of Rights if it is amended to strengthen the protection of the freedom of assembly, freedom of association, professional freedom, academic freedom. The courts can't dispute that if you amend the statute to say you have to give more weight to this. And that's
so
why
to handcuff a little bit the legal decisions that they can't bypass the charter or your legal rights.
Yeah, but attach more weight to it. And we say we have about 20 amendments to this Alberta Bill of Rights to beef it up and its application, particularly during a state of public emergency. And eventually, like this recent decision by the Supreme Court finally saying what seemed obvious to everybody, that the proclamation of the Emergency Act was a violation of the charter, and
it was not necessary. Unlike what we were told from the beginning.
So eventually the law is going to. The law it works very slowly, as you know. But that's a second thing that can be done: strengthen the protection of rights, and strengthen it by amending the statute, not just by giving speeches and not just by criticizing the court. Tell the court we want more weight during a public emergency attached to the protection of rights and freedoms, as well as the protection from the harms of the emergency. And then the third thing, and we didn't get into this very deeply here because our panel was operating during the period prior to the provincial election here, and we didn't want to interject anything into that debate. But one of the
panel was put in place under Jason Kenney's administration, or
which was no, it was made under Premier Smith. Yeah, but one of the things we pointed out is that our healthcare system did not have surge capacity. It did not have the capacity to meet a surge in demand, which is what happens when you have a public health emergency. And then we kind of said secondarily, our system doesn't have the capacity to meet the current demands, because our waiting lines for everything are getting longer and longer. Alberta spends more per capita on healthcare than any other province, and yet our waiting lines are getting longer. So we said we're not going to say how to, we had two types of recommendations. One is, here's a bunch of incremental things that could be done to make the current system work better. There's things we can do to have more doctors and have more nurses and more licensed practitioners and things like that. So we have a short list of many of which the government was already doing or has already done. Yeah. But then we said, if you really want to address this capacity problem, why don't we have this colloquium that I talked about earlier? Why don't we bring in people from these other systems that outperform ours and just find out what are the distinctive characteristics of their systems?
But we know. It's competition.
Yeah, or mixed systems. And how did you get from where they were 30 years ago to where they are now? What changes in the law they have to make? And we said, if you had this colloquium, we'd invite the premier and the health minister and the leader of the opposition. Anybody that's got anything to do, this would be electronically broadcast so the public could look at it. People could come to it without any precondition. You don't have to promise to do anything, but just come and listen.
Open your mind.
Yeah, and if these people can give us some suggestions. So we said 2 countries from Europe and 2 countries from Asia, because we have a lot of Albertans that have an Asian background. And let's just see if we can't come up with some way of expanding the capacity of our system so that it can handle the normal increase in demand, let alone the increase during a crisis.
So because what you're saying is actually that, you know, we've adopted the emergency act, or we were in a state of emergency to save the healthcare system instead of saving the population. That's how we felt in Quebec as well. Because the system is broke and we need to fix it. And you know, our measures went probably way too far because our healthcare system couldn't absorb
and
the crisis
Quebec
at all.
could take the lead in this. There was that court case a long time ago, the Shauli decision.
Was a very good decision.
Yes, where the Supreme Court said, look, if the public system can't meet some demand, then you got a right to go somewhere else. Now, the government of the day actually restricted the application of that. But
they misinterpreted the judgment.
Yeah,
that's how I say
they narrowed down its application so it didn't have the impact it should have had. And that decision was only applicable to Quebec. Like, the court should have said this applies right across the country, but they couldn't. And but Quebec could be in the forefront of this, leading systemic change in the Canada healthcare system. But it would need a federal government that would cooperate. It doesn't even have to do much. Just don't stop somebody else from trying to make the system work better, you know.
How were your recommendations?
Well, it's a little early to say. It's all out. Well, the government welcomed it, but the real challenge now will be to bring these amendments forward to the legislature.
Translate it into bills or into political actions.
And I again, because I have a legislative background, producing the report is not the end result. Often what a lot of the think tanks do is they produce a paper and they have a conference, and that's what they can do. But if you're a legislator, said, okay, how do you change the law in order to make this happen? And that's what we're watching for now, as to what amendments will the government bring forward at this session. They've got a lot on their plate. But many of these amendments, maybe some will come forward in this session, but the rest might come in the fall. So and I keep bugging I try to leave the premier alone, but I keep bugging the ministers and the deputy ministers, saying we didn't do this report just to have it sit on the shelf. So we were watching to see if these amendments can come.
So there's 3 main aspects. I'm just going to repeat it to summarize. The state of emergency, there should be specialists just on emergency, not the healthcare people.
An emergency management agency that's responsible for overall coordination.
No matter which kind of emergency it is. It could be a flood like you had here in Calgary many years ago.
Fires, whatever.
It could be fires, it could be whatever, an accident of a train or accident. there's people who are specialized in emergency, and that's where the decisions are made.
Yeah.
It's not at
Yeah,
the
particularly
public
for
health.
coordination. It doesn't mean that the health department or the natural resource department isn't going to be consulted if there's a fire or a flood, of course, but it's the overall coordination.
And it's interesting because we never understood. It was very easy to fall into the emergency, and it took a long time to get out of it. And I never understood and we never had criterias that were clear, because there was much less people sick and they were still keeping us under the state of emergency.
And a health emergency, the fact that it's become an economic emergency, the fact it's become a human rights emergency, it was understandable at the beginning, because this thing started as a health thing, so give it to the health guys.
Yeah, but mental health, they didn't take it into account, surprisingly.
No.
Be cautious when you say health, because there's parts that they didn't take into account.
Yeah, on the scientific committee here, there was internal medicine specialists said there was no psychologist and no psychiatrist on the...
It was a huge problem.
Yeah. So that's the first one,
that's the first one. The second one is the rights and freedoms, the civic rights and the individual freedoms have to be better protected by our provincial charters, or even the federal. You could have made recommendation at the federal level, but it was not your mandate. But the same thing could have applied federally as well.
And to the Canadian bill, the Canadian Bill of Rights is still in the law, and it's a lot easier to amend than the charter. And so a federal government could strengthen the protection of these basic rights during an emergency by amending that act. But all the provinces have these provincial bills of rights, which are legitimate pieces of legislation. That could be beefed up, particularly its application during an emergency.
To better protect us. And the
Yeah.
third one is fix our healthcare system in Canada, which is deficient,
Address
obviously.
its lack of capacity. It's a lack of capacity to meet emergencies, but it's lack of capacity to meet increasing demands under normal circumstances.
Did you talk about the failures of the crisis, or it was not your mandate to go after people?
No, in fact, we went out of our way to say, look, we're not out to blame somebody or to criticize somebody. We understand that the pressure that they were under, we're not trying to hang somebody. We're just trying to figure out this was a huge event with enormous impacts on every citizen of this province, 4.5 million people, that we at least ought to figure out what went right, what went wrong, and most importantly, what lessons can we learn to better prepare for the future.
I want to talk about the process now, how it was. Did you consult people? Was there a public input? Was there expert input, or was just the committee input?
We just had a small panel. It included it included your colleague Michel Kelly-Gagnon,
Quebecer, who lives in Alberta now.
Who lives in Alberta now, but of course his background with the Montreal Economic Institute gives him quite a background on how other healthcare systems operate, and of course he's been a great proponent of the protection of rights and freedoms, so he was a great asset. Jack Major, who's a former Supreme Court judge, was on the panel. Jack is 92, but he's as sharp as...
So you were the young one of the committee.
But he's sharp as a tack when it comes to these legal things. Jack and I, because of our age, we have trouble even accessing the internet. The government has this secure site that you have to do 49 things to get into. Jack and I used to print paper copies, and we would meet and go over the paper. But Jack was very useful on okay, you want to translate this into legislation, you want to know how the courts will interpret what you're talking about. Jack was very useful in that. Then we had two internal an internal medicine specialist who was up on all the COVID thing, Martha Fulford from Manitoba, actually, and Rob Tanguay, who is a psychologist on the mental health side. We had him, and this was our panel, and then in terms of input, we had on the website, the government's website, when this was set up, we had one question. What changes, if any, do you think should be made in Alberta's laws in order to cover a future public emergency.
So everybody could write their
could,
answers
but
and send it to you.
What came in on it was, what it proved is that 90% of Albertans had no idea which laws governed the response. So then we put up a little list. Here's the statutes. But basically what it told us is there was a huge educational program that had to be done, or should be done in the future, to say, look, these are the laws that govern how your government is going to address the challenge of a public emergency.
So that was the input you got.
Yeah.
Was there other experts that on specific issues that you consulted?
Well, we contracted with a number of other people. One was with Irvin Student, who's heads a think tank that's particularly specialized in the impacts on the educational system, and these were huge. Like, we had school lockdowns that affected 750,000 school children. This resulted in learning losses, which can be repaired afterwards. In fact, the government spent about $150 million trying to repair their learning losses. But the other losses, and this Irvin points out, and this Dr. Tanguay point out, is socialization.
Of course.
Losses. These children, very young children who missed kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2, where the most important thing is not learning ABC or 1, 2, 3. It's the socialization.
And the sports also, the physical activities.
And so we had, and we contracted out to people like Irvin. He did a whole paper that's in the appendices to this report. And then another fellow, there's a fellow in Calgary here, Gerard Lucician, who has put together a think tank called the Regulatory Research Institute of Canada. He's an expert on regulations. And so he gave us a whole bunch of stuff on if you're going to try to cope with this through regulations, here's how you can do it. And we had a lot of that. And then the Montreal Economic Institute actually did some papers for us. So we had these contracted papers. These are all in appendix. The report itself is about 110 pages long, with the 60 of these amendments proposed to the major statutes, and then the appendices are about 300 or 400 pages long, with the papers from these various experts that if people want to get into it in depth. Yeah,
we're going to put the links to with our videos, so we can people who want to know more.
Yeah, those are the big lessons, and they apply to the feds. Get an emergency management agency that's responsible for the overall coordination. Strengthen your protection of bills and rights through the legislation that you can easily amend. And address this question of the lack of capacity of our healthcare system. Those would be the three big lessons.
And I think that applies to any province in Canada. You did it here in Alberta, but in Quebec, I'm sure it would be the three same issues that would come up easily. Well, Mr. Manning, it's a real pleasure, and I'm very honored to talk to you today. We look at you as many of the conservative leaders as someone who changed things in politics, because there's people who win elections but they don't know what to do. We have a premier in Quebec like that he wanted to be premier. He dreamed of being premier his whole life, but you look at what he did on the record and you were wondering what he's doing there. Maybe you weren't prime minister, but you had a vision, and your vision is stronger than ever, and I think it will even survive.
That used to be my father's advice too, because a lot of people consulted him because he was in a long time. He says winning the election is one very important thing, because you can't, but knowing what to do after, and you better think about that before you get there, rather than if you only start thinking about that the day after you get elected. Too late. The other thing he used to say to swearing in new cabinet ministers and was to say, enjoy the swearing in, because the swearing at will start the next day. And you've endured a fair amount of the swearing at. Exactly.
It's not and also in politics, you decide when you want to run, but you don't decide when you're getting out of politics. It's the decision is usually more. Well, your father actually decided when it was time to leave, but usually it's the population that tells you, shows you the door.
That's true. That's true.
So, well, it's a great pleasure. Thank you so much for what you did, and it's very impressive. Also, I don't want to talk about your age, but the fact that you're also a model for of people who've been involved for 5 decades now in politics or in public policy issues, and you're still very active.
Oh, and like I said earlier, it's for all the flaws in our democratic system, the fact that you can do what you're doing in half the countries in the world, you starting a new political party challenge the government, you'd be in jail. And the fact that we can do it here and that we can succeed with these small movements that start with a very small number of people and grow, the fact that we can do that is, Canadians should appreciate that and respect it, because there's not many countries in the world where you can use the democratic process the way that you are doing.
I want to finish by telling you that, Mr. Manning, many Quebecers thought of you because of what they read in the mainstream media 30, 40 years ago, that you were anti-Quebec. I hope that this hour will show them that you're actually probably one of the strongest intellectual allies we have in English Canada. And because you are a true decentralist, you're a true regionalist, and you truly believe in our Constitution and the principles that are behind it.
I'll be Baldwin and you can be Lafayette.
No, but I want to underline it, because you were, you were portrayed as someone that you're not. Yeah. It's the exact opposite. And for political purposes, they've tried to attack you on that. And today, hopefully more and more people are going to find out that it's the exact opposite.
I hope so.
Thank you very much, Preston Manning.
Thank you.
It's a real pleasure.
Okay,
Thank you very much.